The surveillance camera is a device that intriguingly has two functions. First, realistically documenting space, and second, formalistically representing a lived experience that includes the presence of surveillance cameras and their aesthetic. Artists have taken hold of the device for these reasons, creating works that use surveillance camera footage and its unique aesthetic in a manner that raises questions about the representation of reality, specifically the techniques used in cinema to achieve verisimilitude. The type of films that raise this question are surveillance camera cinema, a term created here to distinguish these films from those that simply include the concept of surveillance cameras, or even an approximation of their aesthetic within the story. Each of these three films succeed in raising the question precisely because they combine the qualities unique to the surveillance camera aesthetic with more traditional cinematic representational techniques, playing with the concept of realism through the formalistic anti-Hollywood aesthetic of surveillance camera footage. To investigate the subject of surveillance camera cinema, the aesthetic itself must first be considered. News reports have historically been a common place to see surveillance camera footage, contributing a familiarity with these images and subsequent expectation of how to understand them. Doyle has observed how the news format confirms in surveillance camera footage the immediacy of footage of actual events, where the crudeness, darkness, and graininess of surveillance video comes to connote reality. Yet the viewer lacks the privileged access to information enjoyed by the editor of the report and/or the police investigators who have obtained the footage. The use of what Doyle terms video wanted posters, when the footage is used on television to aid an investigation, occurs only when the police deem it necessary. Furthermore, the juxtaposition of the footage with post facto analysis in a news program exhibits the active role the program takes in framing the video with a prescribed meaning, rather than have its purpose be interpreted by the spectator. Winfried Pauleit understands the images generated by surveillance cameras and subsequently used in news reports to be an inherent double or second reality insofar as these images are fixed upon and produced only in retrospect. The timecode is a significant part of the aesthetic as it refers back to this search and select function of the doubled reality, reminding us that surveillance cameras perpetually record reality rather than begin and end with a specific take, as with cinema. Yet the timecode itself is a constant reminder of the production of the image, pulling the viewer somewhat out of the content's narrative. We begin to see here how the footage is at once considered to have documentary value, but in order to convey a true understanding of the shared time and space, and therefore the unfolding narrative, the footage must be ordered using familiar Hollywood editing strategies. This ordering is quite the opposite of the footage itself, which can be both incoherent due to a lack of context and frankly boring. Surveillance cameras are often used in tandem and observed by one individual manning either a bank of monitors or a single split frame that shows the stream of each camera and require the individual to interpret the footage, usually after the fact, seeking evidence of something that has happened. The typical representation of surveillance cameras in news programs would be upset if the multi-frame quality of the multi-camera surveillance were replicated, because this would not be the mediated, rationalized representation of the event after it occurs. Michael Clear's DER RIESE is split into episodes of different types of surveillance camera footage that are seemingly incongruous in the content of their footage. The episodes are linked only through the interspersed shots of men observing a bank of monitors that makes explicit that the footage in the film is a product of surveillance cameras. The film begins with a plane landing and concludes with footage of a camera surveying the countryside, which imbues the intervening footage with the theme of traveling across space. A fair point to make in a film about footage that itself travels from the place where it is captured to those observing it. However, the last camera is eventually revealed to not be a low-flying plane, but instead a small camera rigged to traverse a plaster model of a countryside, casting the representational quality of surveillance into relief. When the non-surveillance function of the camera is revealed, the confusion over the function of surveillance cameras instills an awareness of how this footage can be mediated, not unlike any other footage, including for non-realistic purposes. We expect surveillance camera footage to be realistic insofar as we trust the transmission of data to be true and unmediated in its arrival. Paul Virilio asserts that a culture of acceleration is visually manifest as early as the telescope, which projected an image of a world beyond our reach and thus another way of moving about in the world, the logistics of perception. This movement is not one of departure, but the arrival of data to the user. Virilio himself observed something similar in DER RIESE specifically, writing, "Clear asserts that surveillance video represents the end and the recapitulation of his art." Whereas in the news report, the photographer, cameraman, remained the sole witness implicated in the business of documentation, here, no one at all is. Indeed, once a cameraman on a rooftop is shown being observed, the person recording the remainder of the footage becomes a structuring absence that we understand to have disappeared with surveillance cameras. The interconnected bureaucratic circumstance that has occasioned the omnipresent and varied use of surveillance cameras is revealed in the footage united in DER RIESE. Clear is implicating both those engaged in the widespread use of surveillance cameras and those responsible for the traditional presentation of surveillance camera footage. He achieves this by employing the footage in a manner that articulates its realism and formalism, underscoring that these are banal documents of space by infusing them with a symbolic function within a narrative film. In so doing, both Clear and the spectator are also implicated because of their role as witnesses of the footage. They are both engaging in control through the initial, though oblique, ordering of the footage and the subsequent interpretation of the footage, respectively. What then is the source of the footage in DER RIESE, and who offers it to Clear for his film? Clear's access to this wide range of footage is alarming, and his role here as mediator is obvious. The film points to the network of archived footage and Clear's ability to stitch it together to suggest a relationship between the footage that may not actually exist. Clear does not align himself with the security guard watching the bank of monitors, but instead the news program's editor. He shows these men watching the footage, but his film deliberately avoids the array aesthetic with which they approach surveillance camera footage. His film gives the illusion of a narrative that the spectator soon realizes will never be made clear, which makes them look at the footage more actively than the guards in order to try to understand what relationship might exist between the shots. Furthermore, the audience of surveillance camera cinema becomes aware of Clear's forced logic as the mediator of the footage after the fact. Specifically, the use of Wagner and other dramatic, non-diegetic music is in line with traditional narrative filmmaking decisions we attribute to a director's artistic vision. The inclusion of this soundtrack is significantly disjunctive when set against the banality of the footage. Constructing an oblique narrative out of disparate footage and imposing a dramatic score undercuts what is often seen as the documentary nature of surveillance camera footage. Influenza also uses editing to reveal the tension between the documentary use of surveillance camera footage and the mediation that occurs when this footage is presented in, say, a news program. While the concept of montage is less ironic in Influenza than in DER RIESE, where disparate footage alludes to a narrative through juxtaposition before ultimately making the viewer ask who is imposing this pseudo-narrative, it is just as significant as an overt aesthetic imposition on Influenza's footage. Bong Joon-ho worked exclusively with footage from surveillance cameras in Seoul. However, the institutions and spaces that these cameras document, i.e. the subway, the bank, private bathrooms, etc., are not spatially linked in the way the contiguity editing aims to convey through the narrative. With each edit, the viewer is aware that time and space have been elided for the film, because there are not surveillance cameras documenting every space in the city that the main character moves through. These gaps are also present in the story, which concerns acts of violence that are not explained in the film because the story's catalyst falls outside the limited frame of the cameras or the footage selected and ordered by the authoritative figure. We never learn why he commits these violent acts. The narrative, then, is in part obfuscated by the limitation of what the cameras have documented, subverting the idea that surveillance cameras are necessarily comprehensive in their documentation, as well as in their after-the-fact narrativization. Virilio's study of what he calls an accelerated culture proposes that chronology's concern with a before, during, and after has been replaced by a chronoscopic concern with underexposed, exposed, overexposed. Surveillance camera technology, which grants visual access to space without the viewer being in that space, is implicated in the pursuit of a total expanse of coverage, with the ultimate goal that no space is underexposed. In this reduction of distance, dichotomies of local global and transnational national are jettisoned in favor of the real instant. This is the signal transmitting data anywhere in the world as it happens, which Vrilya warns reduces control because there is less time to consider a response. He uses a military example to explain this problem over control, where the impossibility of clearly distinguishing between offensive and defensive, due to the temporal confusion between the present and the future, results in a greater inclination for preemptive strikes. Similarly, the central tension of Influenza is the spectator's inability to intervene and stop the violence perpetrated in the film, seemingly as it happens, or even to understand its function. This tension is amplified by the knowledge that these are actual surveillance cameras being used, and thus some of the pseudo-extras are actually frightened by the violent acts. When surveillance camera footage is edited into a narrative after a crime, it is usually for a news report, but here the lack of a return to the news center to close off the violent footage is a disquieting, structuring absence. There is no talking head afterwards to assuage anxiety by reminding the viewer the crime is being investigated. Instead, the footage is both mediated while appearing to be a live transmission. Bong's editing indicates he too is an observer of the acts, and despite having a more authoritative relationship with the footage, and therefore a knowledge of its source, he does not stop the violence. The film is frightening precisely because it appears to be both real and mediated, conveying that no matter how technological advancements offer an increasingly real live document, this footage is nonetheless always presented by someone. The mediation of surveillance camera footage is not always on the part of an authorial figure or institution suppressing information, but can include the citizen's reaction to the circumstance that has given rise to surveillance cameras. Faceless, directed by Manu Luksch, concerns a woman who wakes up in a dystopic environment where the governing machine strips individuals of their identity. She is troubled with recollections of a previous life, which in contrast to her present circumstance included both familial love and artistic expression. The film is constructed entirely out of footage from London, England's series of surveillance cameras, CCTV, which was obtained by Luksch through a protracted bureaucratic process that required her to confirm her presence on the cameras and thus her claim to access the footage. Subsequently, the faces of everyone but Luksch must be masked in her public use of the footage, which is accomplished here by blobs of color over their faces. These blobs are visually incongruous against the washed-out color of the camera footage and the dryly delivered narration that describes this dystopia.
The pulse of real time orients the life of every citizen. Eating, resting, going to work, getting married. Every act is tied to real time.
The footage's aesthetic contains the timecodes, an interface indicating what cameras are operating, and the low-resolution image expected from surveillance cameras. But this footage is then augmented by Luksch through a 5.1 speaker soundtrack of electronic music composed by Mukul Patel. This soundtrack conveys a sense of sound as an abstract concept by being completely non-diegetic, electronically generated, and literally engulfing the spectator through the experimental use of surround sound. These techniques overwhelm the surveillance camera image while still gesturing to the narrative conceit that this occurs within a machine, thereby problematizing the markers of realism in the surveillance camera's image through an intervention by Luksch. After all, the footage itself was not taken to create a sci-fi story, but that is what it has become in this film, turning these markers into grim reminders that the story's world is machine-driven. Faceless, like DER RIESE and Influenza, ironically engages with traditional montage techniques by imposing them upon the live streams of surveillance camera footage. Each shot is cut on Luksch's movement into and out of the camera's frame, linking disparate spaces through contiguity editing. However, there is nothing indicating that these spaces are actually connected beyond the suggestion of the editing. Furthermore, the voiceover also unifies the system of shots into a narrative despite the lack of narrative inherent in the action within the images. In both cases, the time codes in the image confirm that this footage is not temporally linear the way the editing in the voiceover suggests. The film is so conceptually grounded in the gritty realism of the surveillance camera image, but these images themselves provide the real information that subverts the attempts at narrative made through editing and voiceover. Luch's performance for the surveillance cameras as an actress and her intervention after the recording, specifically other individuals' faces being covered, makes the spectator aware in each scene that Luch is both the one recorded and the one mediating. Luch's bureaucratic odyssey to reclaim the footage of herself raises the questions of privacy, namely how institutions, including the government, archive the footage she has since reclaimed. As with the curatorial questions raised in DER RIESE, Faceless illustrates not only the degree to which an individual may be recorded in London, but also that this footage remains available in archives. Luch's film, however, is not simply the manifestation of anxieties surrounding this circumstance, but an illustration of the ways in which the individual may reclaim this experience. As John McGrath observes, there is the avenue of what he terms counter-surveillance. McGrath discusses this phenomenon as the legitimate claim for self-representation made through the attempt to comprehend televisual space from within. The protagonist in Faceless is self-aware that she is recorded, and this televisual space is given a metaphor in the story because all characters live within the machine. Furthermore, the improvisational dance sequences that occur for the cameras, and thus again in the final film, are a means of self-realization and self-representation, even before Luch reclaims the footage. Faceless can be read apart from advocating the abolishment of surveillance cameras, as it illustrates how the individual can engage with them. It also emphasizes both how the media transforms this footage into a narrative through editing techniques, as well as the more formalistic aspects that ensure the audience is aware of how this footage is generated and then mediated. Narratives are mediation, and surveillance camera cinema foregrounds this mediation in order to pose the question: who is recording and then mediating this footage?